about 6 weeks ago, Mr. Coleman said to my class, "You all get to write junior speeches." For my part, I was glad to hear those words. Ever since my freshman year, I'd been thinking about the meaning of life and how and why we ought to love, and how writing well helps us to love the world around us, and how that in turn helps us to write better. My speech on that topic could have been titled, "How to Get an A in Mr. Coleman's Class." And I even contemplated making a joke about that in it. I was just getting started putting ideas together to amaze all of you when something occurred to me that I never really paid attention to. And it took me several days to realize its import. Most of us know that nascantur non paratione means "let them be born in wonder," but I had confused knowing its translation with knowing its meaning. Mr. Coleman had us do an assignment over spring break in preparation for writing our speeches. We each had to choose 3 moments of discovery out of our own lives and write about them as actively as possible. Because I'd already spoken to him about my original idea, I considered just turning in an outline for it instead of the assignment, but decided it wouldn't hurt me to write about 3 great things I learned. Then it came time for me to submit my speech idea, and for some reason, that's when it occurred to me that I had never thought about the meaning of our motto, nascantur non paratione. So, instead of lecturing on the meaning of life in general, I'd like to tell you the 3 stories from my own life that I wrote for Mr. Coleman's assignment, because they helped me as I considered the significance of those 3 words, and because I like telling stories. The first one starts on a day when I was probably between 6 and 8 years old. I'm sitting at the foot of my bed. My mom is sitting on my left, closer to the window, by the head of my bed. What are atoms? Atoms are the things which cannot be broken into smaller pieces. I've heard this several times, and I still can't imagine what atoms are. But I'm determined to find out. I must find the smallest indestructible things. For a long time, I searched my mind. That rubbery stuff that stretches almost indefinitely, bounces, and even takes ink off newspapers, it can't be broken. But surely it's too large, and besides, even though it doesn't break with a snap or a crack, it can be separated into smaller pieces. Silly putty, that's what it's called. What about, just to make sure, what is an atom? An atom is a particle which cannot be broken down. I thought so. I run to the kitchen and shake a small amount of salt onto the smooth, hard counter. Then I began to hit it with my fist, and then with a nearby drinking glass. Not too hard, because it might break and disprove me, but hard enough. What is all that banging? I found atoms! What? Salt cannot be broken, no matter how hard you try. Well, turns out salt crystals are not atoms. But when I started thinking about what nascantur non paratione means, I began to see 3 meanings. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, is that as humans, we are all born to wonder. That's why it mattered to me what atoms are, why I had to know what causes water to expand when it freezes. Why, from the time my grandmother gave me a jar of keys when I was less than 3 years old, I've wondered how a deadbolt in a door moves in a straight line when a key is rotated. The second application is somewhat similar, that specifically during our time at Northfield, but hopefully throughout our lives, we seek to be reborn in a sense of wonder. By reborn, I don't mean that we all want to become cows, or that we ought to want that. Nor am I referring specifically to Christian spiritual rebirth, though I find that the concept of it very nearly parallels what I'm speaking of. But perhaps another story best illustrates the 2 meanings so far mentioned. This one is about the first time I saw the inside of a computer, the aging desktop that my family used to have in our basement. As near as I can tell, I would have been about 9 years old. My dad has just come home from work with a surprise. "What's in the box, Daddy?" "New computer motherboards I got at the garage sale." "Can I help you install them, Daddy?" Sometime later, the computer case lies on a carefully laid out sheet of cardboard, its cover taken off. It's been opened once before that I remember, when the CD-ROM drive stopped working and we bought a new CDRW drive to replace it. But, much to my disappointment, that operation had been completed during my afternoon nap. I don't have to take naps anymore. I studied the exposed parts, observing how they are installed. The video card goes in the first slot. Sound card goes in the second. The modem goes in the third. I must remember this for when I build my own computer. "Look at this," Dad says. A brown square sits on the new motherboard. In the middle of the square, there's a green rectangle the size of my thumbnail. That's what does all the work. In the weeks just before I turned 11, Dad got a whole new computer, and he gave the old one, along with the new motherboards, to me. And I painstakingly constructed my own first computer out of those and a broken computer my uncle had given to me. Since then, I've learned how all the parts work on a level I couldn't even have imagined then. My workshop is stacked with components which I see every day and rarely step on. Now I know I can install cards in any order, except the video card almost always still comes first because it goes into a different type of slot than the others. My thumbnail has outgrown the old 600 megahertz AMD Athlon's core, years ago simply a green rectangle. And in a way, I've forgotten what the inside of a computer looks like. Actually, I can call to mind nearly exactly the appearance of a standard motherboard, or at least of all its chips, slots, and ports. But the expression, "not seeing the forest for the trees," comes to mind. And I don't often think of the computer as a whole, as I did when I was younger. However, as I mentioned, for me, the idea of wonder as a sense of rebirth. On rare occasions, I pull out that computer and those now old motherboards and still wonder how they worked, but in a different way. When I first saw the inside of the computer, I had a general sense of what could be called wonder at the sight before me, but as I had no real knowledge or understanding of it, that experience was effectively limited to, "Ooh, shiny!" Now, as I rearrange stacks of parts in my workshop so that I can get where I'm going, I often see them differently, but no more distinctly. The way that DVD-RW drive works is old news. But sometimes, when I pick up a hard drive, I fully realize that the distance from the metal platter, spinning at anywhere from 5,400 to 10,000 revolutions per minute, to the read-write head, the tiny magnet that polarizes the surface of the platter to record binary data, is 1/50th the width of a human hair. My body of knowledge meets a sense of how much I don't know, forming a creative horizon where true wonder can exist. My learning and growing hasn't diminished my wonder. It has informed, deepened, renewed it. That is the essence of the rebirth quality of wonder. The creative horizon I mentioned is the stage for the third meaning of Nescanter and Admiratione. Before I tell it, though, I'd like to show it through my third story, which ends in my learning that the internet does not exist. Until I was about 11 years old, I thought the internet was just a thing out there. I knew there was lots of information and lots of dangerous stuff, and that it could be searched with a thing called Google. Beyond that, I had no idea even what questions to ask to understand it better. At some point, I learned that it's made up of individual computers, each of which apparently held a part of the internet. But I've still read web addresses, such as http://www.google.com, from left to right, which reinforced my incorrect conception of the existence of the internet. Now, what an HTTP was, I have no clue. And Why was it that some sites needed multiple HTTPs? I would learn later that the S was for secure. On to the stuff I could understand. First, the www part. That stood for the World Wide Web, synonymous with the Internet. Then, the something.com. That took you to a place on the Internet. So far, so good. Then I was confronted with addresses where the www was replaced with something else. I figured that if it was www, then the site existed with the Internet Service Provider, apparently where the Internet lived. If the www was replaced with something else, then the site was huge enough to have itself exist separately, almost as its own Internet type thing. I never really understood how the Internet works until the summer I turned, I believe, 14. I was at the library and picked up the book Networking All-in-One Desk Reference for Dummies by Doug Lowe. It's about 3 inches thick, and I just started reading. Now, halfway through, I learned to read DNS, or domain name system names, from left to right. Wait, no, I did not learn that. I learned to read them from right to left, and everything made sense. The .com, or the .net, or whatever, is the top-level domain. It can be one of 14 3- or 4-letter possibilities, and I'll explain shortly where it comes into play. It's followed by the domain name, which functions something like a family name. It doesn't refer to a specific person or place, but is used to group people together. On the left end is the name of the server. By convention, www, but possibly anything. It works like a first name, unique to a particular person in a family. I should mention that the last part of an address, the part beginning with the slash after the top-level domain, is known as the URL and reads from left to right. That's one of the weird things that happened because Internet protocols weren't designed by all the same people and all at the same time. But that idea of by convention is really what defines the Internet. In actuality, the only thing that makes the Internet what it is many computers all following the same protocols. This gives the Internet an illusion of unity, but in reality, it's extremely decentralized at best. One can't point to anything and say, that is the Internet, and have captured its existence. Even the domain name system is simply a protocol for making the Internet easier to use. This makes more sense in the context of viewing an actual website. Suppose I type http://www.facebook.com into my web browser and hit enter. Thunk. I haven't gone to a place on the Internet. Rather, in the next few milliseconds, my computer contacts another computer called a DNS server and asks for the IP address of the web server www.facebook.com. This is analogous to looking up a phone number. The local DNS server responds that it does not have the IP address for www.facebook.com and forwards the request to the next server higher up in a sort of tree structure. This process repeats itself until the request reaches one of only about 40 root DNS servers responsible for those top-level domains I mentioned. Every DNS server is responsible for a given domain, whether it is the huge .com domain or the google.com domain that represents a small part of it. Each server knows only the details of the level directly below it. None has a complete listing of every computer connected to the Internet which has a DNS name assigned to it. Suppose I'm responsible for knowing contact information for Northfield families. Now, instead of trying to keep up with every single person, I know only the phone number of the father in each family. Then, if someone wants to know Isaac's phone number, I can give him Mr. Vile's number, and he can then call Mr. Vile to get Isaac's number. Thus, in this example, the root server responds that it does not have the IP address for www.facebook.com, but returns the address of the DNS server responsible for the facebook.com domain. My computer then sends the request to the latter server, which finally returns the IP address for the server named www.facebook.com. At most, the process takes a few seconds. Then, the web browser looks at the leftmost part of the address, the HTTP part. Actually, your left is over here. I have written here backwards gesture. Okay. That tells it to use the HTTP protocol, or Hypertext Transfer Protocol, when communicating with 31.13.69.80, the IP address for the www.facebook.com server. That's why we use DNS, because it's just going to remember 31.13.69.80. Facebook's snappier. My computer sends a request in HTTP, and in response, that server sends my computer the contents of the Facebook homepage, again via HTTP, and my computer displays those contents on its screen. Now, the internet isn't a cloud, as it's often depicted for convenience. It has many physical components, but there's little structure. Its organization and its existence are both dynamic. In some cases, one moment a computer can be a client requesting and receiving information from another, and the next, it can be a server sharing information with another client. The more I learned about the internet, the less I could define it, until I'm now convinced that no one definition is sufficient. My reaction to the complete overturning of my old ideas and my inability to define new ones was that the internet must not really exist. How could it, if it could not be described as an object? But now I see that when I recognized it for what it was, it only then started to exist for me. It's not cloud. It's not even round. It's more about the lightning. It has an existence in the brief moment that electric charges are transferred from one computer to another according to protocols that allow me to see what my friends have to say. Trying to define the internet in terms of its physical components is like trying to define the mind in terms of the brain. But it does exist, and it was through wonder that I came to understand it as I did. That's my third point, that true wonder allows us to recognize the world around us. That statement is much more meaningful in consideration of the etymology of the word recognize. The "re" prefix is simple enough. It comes from Latin and means back or again. The next three letters come from the Latin verb cogito ari avi atus, which means to think. The last three letters are a typical ending for Latin verbs in English. In this way, to recognize is to think back and to think again about something. Wonder is an act of convergence. I knew something about atoms and about salt. And when I looked at salt crystals in wonder, I recognized them, albeit incorrectly, as atoms. The internet was created in wonder. People sought out what electricity was, and as they began to recognize it, they began to create things using it and linked it together with it. And the internet continues to inspire wonder, as Vint Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet, so elegantly stated. Every time I get a web page that comes up, I'm sitting here thinking, holy crap, it actually worked. He prefaces this statement by pointing out something key to true wonder. If you know too much about something, it's always astonishing that it works at all. When you know all the things that have to happen, you think that's impossible. I've shared this feeling about the internet for a while now, but it isn't necessary to be a computer nerd to feel the truth of this statement. Consider the intricacies of 9th grade biology, or wonder how it is that you understand what I'm saying. Seriously, thoughts are being thought in my head, expressed as vibrations of air molecules, and recognized in yours with an astonishing degree of accuracy. That is what true wonder means, not having figured out the meaning of life, but being astonished that it works. I don't mean astonished as if gaping at a magic trick, not ignorance, but a recognition of infinity, and yet an active quest for that ever-expanding horizon. Last year, nearly every time I would ask a question in Mr. Birchfield's chemistry class, he would mention two more things that I didn't understand. A lot of the time, one of them would be the concept of electronegativity, which I found out towards the end of the year is the ability of an atom to attract bonding electrons of other atoms. When we finally covered electronegativity, for a while my questions were answered. But this year, I found out that there are several physical factors which contribute to electronegativity, each with their own causes. Even though I understand it better, I'm even more amazed that it works now than I was then. There's another aspect to the statement that wonder is an act of convergence, and that's that it brings people together. I didn't learn to recognize atoms, computers, and the internet on my own. I read books, and I asked many questions. Without others, I would understand very little correctly. Even Copernicus, who first advocated belief in a heliocentric solar system during the Renaissance, I mean, nobody had thought of that before. He didn't ignore those who had come before him. Rather, he reinterpreted knowledge gained over the years. He writes in his Commentariolis that he often considered whether there could perhaps be found a more reasonable arrangement of circles from which every apparent irregularity would be derived, while everything in itself would move uniformly, as is required by the rule of perfect motion. The law of perfect motion, to which he refers, is credited to Aristotle, and without it, he would almost certainly never have arrived at the conclusion he did. Neither the universe nor the internet changed at all for Copernicus or myself. Rather, there comes a time in wonder when you let someone else turn the book right side up. For me, that almost literally happened when I found that I'd been reading domain names backwards. So, rather than present only my ideas, I asked Mrs. Elder to share her thoughts about the meaning of Nescantur in Admiratione. The first thing she said was, "Very good. You want to talk to the ancients." I said that you didn't. Yeah, apparently she's allowed to make fun of herself, but I'm not. Jokes aside, she told me, you should play at things. You should embrace them without fear in order to wonder at them. It's true. Things outside our understanding and our control often inspire fear. To tell the truth, when I started talking to Mrs. Elder about my ideas and asking for hers, I was afraid that she might change my perspective, afraid that I would have to go to the work of rethinking all my ideas and possibly rewriting my speech. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But there is a humility and a vulnerability to the act of wonder. It's one thing to stand up in front of all of you and deliver a speech. It's not like anybody's going to come up afterwards and say, "That was a terrible speech, and I disagree with all your ideas," unless it's Mr. Penning. Even if someone does, I don't have to pay attention. But it's completely different to lay out my thoughts and ask for guidance in my attempt to gain truth through wonder. It's safer in the short term to hold tight to my worldview, a choice that I make all too often out of fear. But if I go beyond quoting the translation of Nescantur in Admiratione and truly recognize its meaning, that we are born wondering, we seek always to renew that sense of wonder, and we learn to recognize other things through it, it's necessary to let go of myself in order to fulfill that effectively. To the extent that I let go of myself, my fear slips away with it, leaving only wonder. Maybe next year, I will tell you how to get an A in Mr. Coleman's class. But it will be in continued wonder and not in isolation.